Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. In this video, we're going to continue our reading of Lavender and Red by Leslie Feinberg, starting with Chapter 10. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. And we want to thank the Workers' World Party at workers.org, who have the copyright to this work, for hosting the file and granting permission to distribute it. Alright, let's begin. Part 10. People of the Moonlight in the Dawn of Revolution. The Bolshevik Party did not merely scrap anti-homosexual Tsarist laws. Sexologist Wilhelm Reich, in The Sexual Revolution, described the intent of the Bolsheviks' political position. They felt it was necessary to tear down the walls that divided homosexuals, also known in Russia as people of the moonlight, from the rest of society. The revolutionaries tried to examine sexuality and gender as they did all social and economic relations, through a scientific lens. Reich explained that the Bolsheviks believed same-sex love harmed no one, and that it was wrong to punish anyone because of their sexuality. And as Lenin and his party won over segments of the middle classes to the goals of the socialist revolution, the young workers' state drew strong support from prominent homosexuals. Russian literary historian Simon Karlinsky, no friend to socialist revolution, admits that, quote, with remarkable unanimity, all male, gay, and bisexual writers welcomed the October takeover, unquote. That include Mikhail Kuzmin, author of Wings, and Nikolai Klyasev, considered the unofficial poet laureate of the Russian peasantry. Historian Dan Healy puts this accomplishment in a larger historical context. Quote, Soviet Russia was by far the most significant power since the French Revolution to decriminalize male same-sex relations, while Britain and Weimar Germany continued to prosecute homosexuals. Soviet health authorities courted the left-leaning sex reform movement headed by Berlin sexologist and homosexual rights campaigner Magnus Hirschfeld. Biologists and doctors, chiefly sponsored by the Commissariat of Health, began to investigate homosexuality as a scientific and medical phenomenon, often from sympathetic perspectives that were, in comparative terms, markedly advanced, unquote. The weight of material suffering during those years was unbearable. By early 1918, after nearly 4 years of devastating imperialist war, the urban food ration was 4 ounces of bread a day, and nothing else. During the years of war communism, the Civil War of 1918 to 1921, when the worker state was surrounded and under siege, internally and externally, there was little record of any, quote, gay life. The revolution had occurred in the weakest link of the capitalist chain. Russia was semi-feudal and profoundly underdeveloped technologically, making the task of raising production to meet the needs of all more onerous. And the worker state was an island in a sea of raging imperialism, determined to engulf the first successful socialist revolution. New economic policy. In order to rebuild the productive apparatus, Lenin called for a partial and temporary return to a market economy in 1921 with the adoption of the new economic policy. His arguments for the NEP included frank warnings of the dangers inherent in reintroducing capitalist relations in a planned economy. Healy has produced valuable accounts on this period. Quote, surprisingly, despite the 7-year hiatus of war, revolution, and civil war that concluded in 1921, he writes, much of the male homosexual underworld that existed before 1914 reconstituted itself in the early years of the new economic policy. Street cruising and male prostitution returned to Moscow and Petrograd with the same toilets, parks, and boulevards, providing arenas for the market in both paid and unpaid sex between men, unquote. He emphasizes that the homosexual male subculture under Tsarism had relied in part on privately owned commercial spaces like bathhouses and restaurants. These small-scale capitalist enterprises were closed down by the reorganization of a planned economy, which impacted on patterns of the, quote, commercialization of same-sex relations. Quote, despite homosexuals' increasing difficulty under Soviet rule in controlling private spaces, Healy adds, they occasionally managed to use domestic or other semi-private venues like halls or cabarets to gather. The relative openness of homosexual entertainments tapered off rapidly after the Civil War, but a few sources hint at their more discreet continuation. Many of the best records of gatherings come from the Petrograd-Leningrad subculture, where a tradition of popular private homosexual assemblies was well established, unquote. During the NEP, he documents, quote, Antonoi, or Antinous, a private art circle devoted to the appreciation of male beauty in prose, verse, drama, and music, functioned in Moscow during the early 1920s, staging readings of consciously homosexual poetry, recitals of music by our own composers, and even an all-male ballet. The group made plans to publish an anthology of homosexual verse from ancient to modern times, an attempt to reconstruct an ennobling past, unquote. However, the group seemed to have disbanded after finding it difficult to rent meeting space or to publicize its events, quote. But it would be misleading to claim that Soviet policies alone drove people into the toilets, Healy concludes. Marginal public spaces were well-established sexualized territories, geographic expressions of a lively, urban male homosexual subculture. After 1917, male homosexuals and their male sexual partners continued resorting to public lavatories and other civic amenities, like parks and boulevards, because they were spaces where participants could recognize and meet each other, according to familiar rituals, unquote. The position of the Bolsheviks in the 1920s was very clear. They opposed the economic exploitation of women, men, and children represented by prostitution, but they were not for penalizing the prostitutes. And they did not believe that sexuality was a matter for state intervention. Part 11. The Soviet Union in the 1920s. Scientific, not utopian. During the 1920s, in the first decade of the Russian Revolution, signs that the struggle to build socialism could make enormous social gains in sexual freedom, even in a huge, mostly agricultural country, barely freed from feudalism, then ravaged by imperialist war and torn asunder by civil war, were apparent. The Russian Revolution breathed new life into the international sexual reform movement, the German homosexual emancipation movement, and the revolutionary struggle as a whole in Germany and around the world. It was a historic breakthrough when the Soviet Criminal Code was established in 1922 and amended in 1926, and homosexuality was not included as an offense. The code also applied to other republics, including the Ukrainian republics. Only sex with youths under the age of 16, male and female prostitution and pandering were listed. Soviet law did not criminalize the person being prostituted, but those who exploited them. For example, author Dan Healy states, quote, "The revolutionary regime repeatedly declared that women who sold their bodies were victims of economic exploitation, not to be criminalized, and campaigns to discourage them from taking up sex work were launched," unquote. The growth of prostitution had, of course, been spurred by the chaos and dislocation of people accompanying war. Historian Laura Engelstein summarizes, quote, "Soviet sexologists in the 1920s participated in the international movement for sexual reform, and criminologists deplored the use of penal sanctions to censor private sexual conduct," unquote. In 1923, the Soviet Minister of Health traveled to the German Institute for Sexual Science and reportedly expressed there his pride that his government had abolished the czarist penalties against same-sex love. He stated that, quote, "No unhappy consequence of any kind whatsoever have resulted from the elimination of the offending paragraph, nor has the wish that the penalty in question be reintroduced been raised in any quarter," unquote. Also in 1923, Dr. Grigory Batkis, director of the Moscow Institute of Soviet Hygiene, published a pamphlet titled The Sexual Revolution in Russia. It stated, quote, "Soviet legislation bases itself on the following principle. It declares the absolute non-interference of the state and society into sexual matters as long as nobody is injured and no one's interests are encroached upon," unquote. And the pamphlet spelled this out clearly, quote, "Concerning homosexuality, sodomy, and other forms of sexual gratification, which are set down in European legislation as offenses against public morality, Soviet legislation treats these the same as so-called natural intercourse," unquote. In Germany, the vicious Prussian paragraph 175 was the law of the land in 1923. That same year in the U.S., where anti-sodomy laws aimed to padlock closet doors, the FBI had labeled anarchist Emma Goldman, quote, "most dangerous woman in America because of her vocal support for gay rights and other forms of social equality." In Britain, the Buggery Act of 1533 had proscribed death by hanging, the death penalty not formally removed until 1861. But the 1855 Criminal Law Amendment Act criminalized any form for male homosexual expression that offended a jury, quote, "gross indecency," with up to 2 years with or without hard labor. Oscar Wilde, a feminine homosexual, was convicted under this law in 1895. It took 82 more years to repeal this repressive measure. Ups and downs. On January 15, 1921, a raid took place in Petrograd that may have been sparked by official fears of a large private gathering of soldiers and sailors. It turned out that those gathered were carrying out a wedding ceremony. Some 95 soldiers, sailors, and civilians were arrested in the only such raid known during that period on a party of male homosexuals and cross-dressers in Petrograd. Healy explains, quote, "A lone Justice Commissariat lawyer argued that this raid was justified despite the decriminalization of sodomy, for public displays of homosexual tastes endangered suggestible personalities. He proposed prosecuting such overt demonstrations of these tastes," unquote. When the Bolsheviks struck down the Tsarist anti-gay laws, that political act challenged the prejudices that were deeply embedded from centuries of class rule. But it could not change everyone's attitudes in the population overnight. From that standpoint, however, Healy's findings are very significant. No such charges based on cross-dressing or public displays of homosexuality have come to light. Quote, "Few other jurists advocated such a criminalizing approach, and most explained the absence of a sodomy ban as a feature of the sexual revolution," unquote. The eminent psychiatrist V.M. Bekhterev wrote about those arrested as, quote, "sexual deviants." It's worth recalling that he began his career of professor of psychiatry at the Academy of Military Medicine under the Tsar, the same military that had adopted legislation in 1706 and 1716 mandating the death penalty as punishment for male same-sex love between soldiers. While feminine males were generally not as socially accepted as masculine females, Healy notes, quote, "Soviet sources of the 1920s continue to mention the use of female nicknames and occasional indulgence in cross-dressing, although these practices were evidently reserved for private events and spaces," unquote. The great Russian novel Wings, by Mikhail Kuzmin, about same-sex love between men, was republished and brought out in Berlin in 1923 by a literary house owned by the Soviet government. Modern anti-communist historians have denounced the early Soviet workers' state based on reports that the Bolsheviks used charges that male clerics were having sex with boy children during public trials of church officials. While not understanding the impact of political backwardness about same-sex relations in the trials of clerics from the church hierarchy, more study must be done to find out how much of these measures resulted from outrage at sexual abuse, much like the outrage over exposures of the rapes of boy and girl children in the modern Catholic Church scandal. More thorough primary research about these trials is needed. Any attempt to gloss over instances of backwardness only sets back the struggle to build socialism in the long run. However, simplistic anti-communist arguments do far greater damage. Survivals of primitive custom. While the October 1917 revolution in Russia, the heart of the Tsarist oppressor nation, eradicated the laws against homosexuality, Soviet governments in the Caucasus and Central Asia, where homosexuality was reportedly widespread, did enact laws against some forms of same-sex expression in the 1920s. In 1928, the People's Commissariat of Justice of the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic replied to a request from Magnus Hirschfeld's Scientific Humanitarian Committee in Germany, which wrote to ask the state of homosexuals in the Soviet Union. The response stated in part that, quote, "pederasty, sexual abuse of boy children by adult men, was punished, quote, in particular republics where pederasty is especially common," unquote. The Bolsheviks' struggle against the sexual exploitation of children is a matter of public record. However, there is also backwardness in this attitude toward the republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus that cannot be examined outside of the context of the, quote, national question and the centuries of entrenched Great Russian chauvinism toward these formerly oppressed nationalities. These vast new republics of the Soviet Union had different customs, languages, and economies than Russia had, and diverse attitudes toward the sexes, gender expression, and sexuality. Some of these societies, closer to the legacy of their communal pasts, appeared to retain more widespread acceptance of same-sex love and trans expression, even where class divisions had formed. Historian Laura Engelstein writes that in the early 1900s in Tsarist Russia, jurist V.D. Nabokov had noted that laws of homosexuality, quote, had changed over time and still varied across cultural traditions. There was no single, absolute standard common even to the Christian world upon which to base consistent legal norms, unquote. She concludes that, quote, Nabokov must have been aware of the testimony of judges from the Muslim areas of the Russian Empire, who explained the impossibility of enforcing the Tsarist anti-sodomy laws among peoples who did not disapprove of homosexual behavior, unquote. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, the early Bolsheviks unlocked the cell door of the Tsarist prison house of nations by forming a voluntary Soviet Union of Russia with the formerly oppressed nations that had been coerced under Tsarist rule. Lenin steeled his party to support the right of self-determination, including the right to separate from Russia, of nations that had been forcibly held in bondage by the imperial state. At the same time, the Bolsheviks organized unity and class solidarity of the workers and peasants in the oppressed and oppressing nations to fight the propertied classes that exploited their labor. Even the seizure of state power and the setting up of a government that defended the right of self-determination, however, did not end racism, national chauvinism, or anti-Semitism among Great Russians with a single blow. The effort to eradicate every vestige of national oppression and the attitudes it engendered was a process, and an uneven one. And there had been as yet no thorough historical materialist view of sexuality. The painstaking task of examining questions of society and culture in order to weed out bigotry and superstition that had resulted from centuries of ruling class ideology was severely impeded by the relentless imperialist onslaught. The Soviet Union had no homosexual emancipation movement like the one that had arisen in Germany and had gathered and archived vast cross-cultural, cross-historical information about the sexes, gender expression, and sexuality. Sexual exploitation. Laws were enacted against sodomy and the keeping of bocce, cross-dressed, feminine boy dancers kept as prostitutes, in the Soviet republics of Azerbaijan in 1923, Uzbekistan in 1926, and Turkmenistan in 1927. The 1928 Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic Criminal Code, for example, grouped 8 laws against male same-sex relations with others adopted against, quote, survivals of primitive custom. The role of Russian national chauvinism and backward attitude towards same-sex love and what today would be called transgender needs to be thoroughly examined. The greatest contributions, of course, will be made by revolutionary researchers from those nationalities, who can disentangle historical forms of gender expression and sexuality in their historical context, both ancient and enduring, from forms of commercial exploitation that arose with the development of class relations. The struggle against sexual exploitation was an important focus of these Soviet laws. Healy gives the most thoughtful account of this aspect of the law's intent, quote, just as revolutionary jurists had rejected the criminalization of female prostitutes in the Russian Republic, in Uzbek and Turkmen law, the male prostitute himself was not banned, but virtually every other aspect of the masculine sex trade was prohibited, unquote. Healy elaborates, quote, the men who kept youthful male prostitutes were regarded by Bolshevik legal drafters as class aliens, capitalists making deals with families to maintain male children and youths, quote, educating their charges and exploiting them sexually while providing public entertainment. In their first Soviet Criminal Code of 1927, Bolshevik jurists in the Turkmen SSR adopted similar but less elaborate language, primarily directed against those who committed offenses involving bocce who were minors, unquote. And, quote, in Uzbekistan, the sexual harassment of men was made a crime, in language that mirrored the Russian Republic's path-breaking 1923 statute protecting women from the same offense, unquote. Part 12. 1920s Soviet Union. Rights for lesbians, transgenders, transsexuals. According to historian Dan Healy, quote, unlike their male counterparts, Russian women who had erotic relations with members of their own sex had less access to the public sphere, and so were less able to construct for themselves a coherent subculture with the attributes of the male homosexual world. This is not to suggest that no female homosexual subculture existed in revolutionary Russia, unquote. Healy has made a great contribution toward digging up some of the records of the lives of lesbians, masculine females, and transsexual men in revolutionary Russia during the 1920s. Much of this research can be found in his book, Sexual Desire in Revolutionary Russia, University of Chicago Press, 2001. He offers this caveat, quote, adequate sources about this love between lower-class women have yet to emerge, and its character must be judged through the distortions of a single ubiquitous occupation, prostitution, unquote. In the business of prostitution during the capitalist era, quote, same-sex relations could be sheltered and even tolerated, particularly in licensed brothels, and the freedom or opportunity to express same-sex love in this environment was evidently sought by some women as prostitutes and as clients, unquote. Brothels, he writes, quote, constituted a social sphere that undoubtedly sheltered some same-sex relationships, but this harsh environment offered sex workers rather limited prospects for agency and self-expression, unquote. But the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution both abolished licensed brothels and took over privately owned hotels and other businesses. This had an impact on prostitution. Quote, the abolition of licensed brothels, Healy says, turned prostitution into a very unstable and dangerous livelihood for female sex workers, unquote. During the 1920s, quote, the housing shortage and the decline in private control over sheltered urban spaces appeared to drive illicit heterosexual sex into the streets, railway stations and carriages, restaurants, bathhouses, and taxicabs. Russian historians have argued that the more urban women and more declassed women from the former elite supposedly turned to casual or occasional heterosexual prostitution in the 1920s as urban unemployment hit them hardest, unquote. The Bolsheviks tried to abolish sexual exploitation, but they did not prosecute the women. Quote, the revolutionary regime repeatedly declared that women who sold their bodies were victims of economic exploitation, not to be criminalized, and campaigns to discourage them from taking up sex work were launched, unquote. However, ending the economic need that drove people into prostitution required raising the living standard for all. The constant imperialist sabotage of the Soviet economy from within and without, and the devastation that was the legacy of the World War, made that essential economic task difficult. Demanded right to same-sex marriage. In both Europe and the US at that time, very rigid social codes enforced what was deemed appropriate behavior and dress for males and females. In Soviet Russia, however, masculine females were finding a prominent place in the early revolutionary society. They included many out lesbians. Masculine, cross-dressing females could be found in academic and cultural institutions, as well as in the military, even high up in the Red Army Command. This acceptance sheds light on the vulgar anti-communist typecasting of Soviet women as so mannish that they might really be males in drag. Quote, if there was any sign of a lesbian subculture moving into the public realm of urban streetscapes, the workplace, or halls of study, Healy elaborates, it was in the almost masculine styles cultivated by some women entering public life. Medical and lay sources confirm that, at least in towns, the woman regarded as masculine was a fixture of early Soviet society, unquote. Healy says, quote, their image as energetic and enterprising participants in the new society's political, economic, and military life earned the so-called active, that is, imitative of so-called masculine traits, female homosexual, admiration from some sexological authorities, unquote. In an earlier essay, Healy notes, quote, in a 1929 discussion about transvestites and the, quote, intermediate sex, conducted by the Expert Medical Council of the Commissariat of Health, women of the, quote, masculized type, cross-dressing army commanders, for example, were considered with fascination and indulgence, unquote. And some of these cross-dressing females demanded the right to same-sex marriage. But while there was an out social current of masculine females who were identified with same-sex love, other female-bodied individuals sought to live as males. Was the motivation of all these female-bodied individuals to express their masculinity and or cross-dress driven solely by sexuality? In other words, in today's U.S. terms, were they all lesbians? Or would some of them be more accurately identified as transgender or transsexual? Transgender and transsexual lives emerge. The Bolsheviks tried to replace mysticism and idealism with a scientific approach to all social and economic questions, including gender expression and sexuality, and what in modern terms would be called transsexuality. Quote, Soviet psychiatry of the 1920s took an interest in women who convincingly occupied a male gender identity, Healy states, and in accordance with the evolving sexological categories of European science, labeled them female homosexuals, or occasionally transvestites, unquote. Healy adds that, quote, the reasons why some women decided to acquire manhood by changing their identity documents, assuming male variants of their names, and altering their dress, manners, and hairstyle are hard to reconstruct, unquote. One of the most famous of these individuals was the soldier Evgeny Fedorovich, born Evgenia. While posted with a regiment, Fedorovich married a woman postal employee in a provincial town in 1922. When Fedorovich's birth sex was discovered, local authorities charged the marriage was a, quote, crime against nature. But the Commissariat of Justice found that the marriage was, quote, legal because concluded by mutual consent, unquote. Evgeny Fedorovich wrote using concepts of the period in which homosexuality and intermediate sex were intertwined. Fedorovich argued for acceptance of, quote, same-sex love as a particular variation, unquote, of human sexuality, and stated with conviction that once individuals of the, quote, intermediate sex were, quote, no longer oppressed and smothered by their own lack of consciousness and by petty bourgeois disrespect, their lives would become, quote, socially worthwhile. Hear, hear. Demand for sex reassignment. As the Bolsheviks tried to examine social questions in a scientific light, individuals came forward to press social demands on the scientific community. That included the request for medical sex reassignment. A 23-year-old female-bodied respondent to a 1923 sex survey of students at Sverdlov University in Moscow wrote, quote, I want to be a man. I impatiently await scientific discoveries of castration and grafting of male organs, glands, unquote. The student expressed optimism that science would one day be able to achieve this desired goal. Healy explains that this request was not exceptional or unusual. However, quote, the medical techniques of gender reassignment in Soviet Russia in the 1920s were as rudimentary and broadly unsuccessful as those then available in the West, unquote. Despite this limitation, individuals began seeking out, quote, clinical psychiatrists and biologists engaged in the emergent study of the mechanisms of sex differentiation, unquote, to request sex reassignment. Passing in the countryside? It's not clear from the following description by Healy whether he is talking about the pre- or post-revolutionary epochs or both. Quote, outside of Russia's great cities, some female homosexuals turned to more traditional methods of appropriating the privileges of masculinity, effecting self-transformations with clothing and gestures that allowed them to pass as men, unquote. Healy ascribes sexuality as a primary reason why some would live as another sex. Quote, some used their acquired masculinity as a pathway to sexual relations with other women, he writes. Quote, these total transformations typified the survival of the passing woman in Russian culture, unquote. Sexuality may or may not have been a driving factor for some individuals, but it doesn't explain the entire phenomenon. Many of these individuals must certainly have lived without a sexual partner for fear of being outed. Therefore, going underground with an identity would not have easily facilitated finding sexual partners, and it was no secret in any village or rural area that there were jobs and greater anonymity in the cities. At the time, of course, homosexuality was inextricably linked to the, quote, intermediate sex. However, in actuality, a feminine homosexual female would have found it difficult to live as a male. Comfort with masculine gender expression and body type certainly also played an important role. It would also be of great interest to know whether these individuals were in the closet or whether some found social acceptance, unspoken or not, among the peasantry. While peasants had been chained to the land under medieval conditions in the Tsarist era and force-fed superstition and prejudice as a class, they were keen observers of variance in nature, and Healy himself notes that the sexual patterns and practices of the mass of Russians was marked by pagan survivals. The pre-class beliefs about the sexes, gender expression, and sexuality still held some sway among the peasantry. Healy found the research of a lexicographer who, gathering material in the 1830s and 1850s in Central Russia, discovered numerous terms for masculine females, and none of them were insults. And the researcher found that female-bodied peasants were defined as, quote, resembling a man in their appearance, movements, voice, etc., quote, by structure, by body formation, or because they might, quote, even approach the condition of a hermaphrodite woman, unquote. This fact from Healy's study of the peasantry is very illuminating. Quote, rural and lower-class Russians possessed an array of items to describe individuals who appeared or behaved like members of the opposite sex. They associated this gender marginality with hermaphroditism observed in domesticated animals, linking social qualities with the familiar phenomenon of physical sexual indeterminacy. Unquote.